Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 67 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they take on the Chicago Blackhawks and won by a score of 4-2. Now, last season it was relatively easy to just hope the Sharks would lose a bunch of games, come last place, get the first overall pick, and end up drafting Macklin Celebrini. All of these things would end up occurring and ultimately made that season worth it for San Jose. But this year, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You're wanting to have more of a positive mindset, and this is because the Sharks roster currently features a lot of their future players, like Celebrini, as well as Will Smith, and more recently guys like Colin Graff and Shakir Mukhamadullin. You don't want to be coming into these games thinking, oh, I hope these players get their spirits absolutely crushed by getting dog-walked by the Colorado Avalanche or the Dallas Stars on a consistent basis. You want them to have some fun, some excitement in their first seasons in the NHL. And this simply is not going to happen by losing 15 straight games. There need to be some wins here or there. So instead, you want to be approaching the games this season hoping that the Sharks can pick up the win, while knowing in the back of your mind that realistically the Sharks are going to lose more often than not anyway. Now, this is the case for most of the games this season, but not tonight. This was the exception, and that is because the Sharks at the beginning of the day had 43 points, last place in the standings. The team in 30th was the Buffalo Sabres at 56. That is a 13-point difference, meaning if the Sabres were to lose every single one of the remaining games on their schedule, which is obviously not going to happen, they should win at least like 3 or 4, probably even more than that, but just for the sake of argument, let's say they lost every single one. For the Sharks to pass them, they'd have to win 7 of their remaining 16 games. And with the pace that the Sharks have been at this season, that's not very likely to happen either. And so realistically, there are 30 teams here in the NHL that are simply not contesting for this last place spot anymore. The only team that is their opponent tonight, Chicago, who came in with just a 6-point lead over the Sharks. This was the possibility of a 4-point swing. Had the Blackhawks won, they'd be 8 points above San Jose, a relatively insurmountable gap, but with the Sharks winning as they did, they are instead just 4 points behind Chicago. That means they only have to win 2 more games than them going down the stretch here, and with how solid the Sharks have actually looked since the Four Nations break, this is actually a possibility. And at this point of the year, where the difference between 32nd and 31st literally only comes down to draft lottery odds, and we saw how key that was just last season for the Sharks to get number 1, it certainly would have been nice had they ended up losing this one. But it doesn't end up occurring. And moving on to the details of this game, it was the first matchup between Celebrini and Bedard. The first 2 times these teams met this season, Celebrini was actually injured. So we're finally getting the first overall pick of this year versus the first overall pick of last year. There's really not much of a rivalry here because since both of these teams are quite bad, there's not really any bad blood or anything like that. Perhaps in a few years' time, maybe there's a playoff series or 2 that gets played. Suddenly you can actually have something. But of course, for the NHL, it's still kind of a, 2 consecutive first overall picks. I would personally say Celebrini got the better of this matchup. Didn't really notice Bedard too much in these first couple of periods. Started to pick it up a little bit in the third, but then ended up getting a 10-minute misconduct at the halfway mark and basically didn't play for the rest of this game. Sort of a weird misconduct that came seemingly out of nowhere, but still, in the end, does feel as though Celebrini got the better of this matchup, but that's neither here nor there. In the first period, I would say the Sharks didn't look amazing for those first couple of minutes as they were rolling each of their lines at the beginning of this game. Couldn't really get much going through the neutral zone, but after those first 2 minutes, the Sharks really woke up and really started pushing the pace there, got some great chances, got some zone entries, and it eventually ended up with a Will Smith goal. Great pass by William Eklund. He gets it to Macklin Celebrini, who tees one up for his buddy Will Smith, and it is one of those goals that is involving these 3 young players for the Sharks. Rumor has it that an angel gets its wings every time that occurs, and while this wasn't the prettiest of goals, one that Spencer Knight, the Blackhawks goaltender, should have probably had, it is the one that puts the Sharks up 1-0. Then it is Colin Graff, another young player who does get involved here, a second straight game with a goal for himself, and it is 2-0 San Jose after the first period. The second period rolls around. The Blackhawks actually have a power play for just a few seconds here, and it seems as though Warsofsky did not take this particularly seriously. He wanted to just treat it as though the Sharks were starting 5-on-5, and the players seemed to be taking that approach as well. They were not ready to actually be still down going 5-on-4, and it's important to mention that even though there's only 4 seconds left here, it's not as though the moment that those 4 seconds run out, suddenly it's immediate 5-on-5. That player still needs to come out of the box and insert themselves back into the play. So it's actually a few seconds longer than that, and Nazar is able to take advantage by cutting the lead in half. It is now 2-1. Then it is Colin Graf on the power play who gets his second of the game and restores the 2-goal lead for San Jose before Mikheyev cuts it back to 1 with this goal, and it is a 3-2 Sharks lead after 40 minutes. The dreaded third period lead. The Sharks, we know, there's no secret, they've struggled in this position, but going up against a team that is only marginally better than them in the standings, which of course has been very rare this season, they're actually able to hold on to it through the entirety of this third period. The only other goal that ends up getting scored is from Tyler Toffoli with the empty netter, his 25th of the season, and that does it for the game. The Sharks pick up the win 4-2. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line, which is once again that 70s line, Celebrini, Eklund, and Toffoli. We moved away from this for a few games after a swap back, I believe it was against the Toronto Maple Leafs, but reunited once more, and it looked exceptional in this first period. All three of these players playing very, very well in those first 20 minutes. It did kind of fall off a little bit. I'll start off with William Eklund, who was absolutely flying in those first 20. It looked like he was just going to be in line to have a spectacular game for himself. Couldn't quite find those same level of openings in the second and third period, so ultimately doesn't end up being a great game for Eklund, but I thought he was all right. When it comes to Macklin Celebrini next, I had mentioned how he did get the better of the matchup with Connor Bedard. He picks up the primary assist on this Will Smith goal. He ends up with the tertiary assist, which of course doesn't actually count on the second Colin Graf goal, but it was still a moment at the end of a shift there on the power play. As you're shifting over towards that second power play unit, Celebrini stays on, creates this zone entry, sets this one up for Mukhamadullin, who feeds it to Smith, and then, gets to Graf for the goal. So even though Celebrini doesn't pick up the point, he was still a key piece of this goal actually getting scored. So ultimately, I still thought that it was a pretty good game, I would say, for Celebrini, and especially in that first period. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, as I mentioned as well, really strong start, maybe not the best of finishes, but he also gets the empty netter, which was good to see. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have this kind of new look for it because of the fact that there is really only 5 set-in-stone top 6 players. We have a bit of a rotating carousel of top 6 guys. Last couple of games, it was Klim Kostin. Tonight, the chance is given to Colin Graf, and he runs with this opportunity. Previously, we had been seeing some offensive flair from Graf, but not really a chance to put it to use because of the bottom 6 roles that he has been on. This was the chance to step up, and he did, and it was very much a nice thing to see. Obviously, the storyline throughout this season has been Celebrini. It has been Will Smith, especially recently as well, and those have been the 2 young players leading the way. William Eklund too, but obviously this isn't his first full season in the NHL. That was last year. But with Colin Graf, he's also a very important piece of this rebuild. You can't just win with 2 players. Just ask the Edmonton Oilers. They'd have like 7 Stanley Cups if Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl could just do it alone. That's just not simply how it works. You need other players to step up. And when the Sharks originally got Graf at the end of last season, he played a few NHL games and he looked way in over his head. He just didn't seem to belong. But it was still very important for him to get those games so that he could truly get a taste of what it's like in the NHL and understand what he needs to do so that he can eventually belong. Now, this season, he would end up starting in the AHL. I mean, this was not that much of a surprise. The Sharks clearly came in with an idea of what their opening night lineup would look like. Really only Danil Gushin's insane preseason was able to ham-fist himself into that starting roster, but otherwise the Sharks knew what they wanted and Graf was not part of that. But he had done so well with the Barracuda that eventually he did get the call-up. It wasn't amazing the first time around, but the second time around, starting in that bottom 6, he really found a home for himself and has worked his way up to this position, and it has gone very, very well for himself. That first goal, some good work by Alex Wenberg, but he activates into the slot at the perfect moment and a great shot too. And then keep your stick on the ice. puck will come towards you if you're at the net, and it's exactly what happens on his second goal. So very good to see him get rewarded for the contributions that he has been making in many of these last few games. When it comes to his two line mates, and then we move on to Alex Wennberg, who continues to just be rather solid for the Sharks, has that type of offensive talent that can very much help complement a guy like Will Smith, who has a ton of playmaking ability, and a guy like Colin Graf, who very much knows just to keep it simple, head to the net, and has a pretty good shot as well. Wennberg has been really tying this all together, strong in the forecheck, a lot of patience, also has some strong playmaking ability. We see him on this first Colin Graf goal. All in all, playing very solid right now. And then when it comes to Will Smith, a lot of good to be said about Will Smith for sure. He picks up another couple of points here, now over a point per game since that homecoming matchup against the Boston Bruins. So he gets this goal. He picks up the primary assist on the second Colin Graf goal as well. So offensively, there's really not much to criticize here. He even had a really strong offensive zone shift. I can't remember if it was in the first or the second period, where he's just doing it all below the goal line, working hard, protecting the puck, which is not something that you're necessarily seeing from Smith every day. So it again is showing the progress that he is making. Defensively this game, there were definitely a couple of suspect moments, and Warsofsky ends up maybe taking it a little bit too far at the end of this game, because during those last few minutes, the Sharks had decided to just go with just two lines pretty much. They put on the first line, then the second line, then back to the first, then back to the second, and then just oscillating between these two trios, not seemingly trusting any of their bottom six players to actually get a defensive zone shift to hold on to this 1-goal lead, which is fine, but we saw Smith actually get substituted out in favor of Barclay Goodrow. The Sharks were running a second line of Graf, Wennberg, and Goodrow over those last few minutes. And I'm fine if this is like with 1 minute left, a defensive zone faceoff, because Smith is obviously not excelling in this particular area. But when there's 5 or 6 minutes left, which is when this started, you'd much rather see Smith get the normal shift, especially since Warsofsky continues to heavily overrate Barclay Goodrow's defensive capabilities at 5-on-5. But at the end of the day here, when it comes to Will Smith, offense is what he's always going to excel in as a player, and what he has truly been having so much success with as of late. You know, you think to the player who Will Smith has said has been his idol growing up, Patrick Kane, one of the best American forwards of all time, perhaps even the best American player of all time. He was someone who was so incredibly skilled offensively, but didn't really bring much from a defensive standpoint. Will Smith maybe modeling his game slightly after him. You'd want to see maybe somewhat of a better developed 200-foot game, but at the end of the day, if you're scoring points, people aren't really going to ask you too many questions. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Kovalenko with Kostin and Dellandrea. I had some hope for this line of a physical presence like Dellandrea, with some decent offensive talent in both Kovalenko and Kostin, who could also be somewhat physical, will fight for pucks along the boards. I thought this could end up working out somewhat. They did have like 1 or 2 pretty good shifts, one really strong one in the offensive zone, but that just wasn't enough to get you all that excited. And what ended up happening here is that there was actually a lineup swap, as Dellandrea would end up getting put down to the fourth line in favor of Patrick Giles in the latter parts of this game. But let us start off first with Klim Kostin. There were some good moments for Kostin. There were some bad, as is usually the case for this player. Clearly not really doing much to work himself back into that top 6 conversation. At this point, I think bottom 6 is where will be finding himself for much of the rest of this season. And at this point, you're probably just hoping that, or at least he's hoping, that he'll be able to avoid being a healthy scratch at any point. When it comes to the other winger on this line, Kovalenko, you are hoping for more from this player. It's someone who the Sharks specifically targeted from Colorado in that Mackenzie Blackwood trade. He had come in originally. He was putting up some points. You were hopeful that that would look to continue. I understand, of course, that Kovalenko is not playing with Celebrini, is not playing with Toffoli like he had been at times in those early parts, but still more offense you're hoping for, and it hasn't quite happened, even if occasionally the effort is there. And then when it comes to Ty Dellandrea, I certainly wasn't surprised that Warsofsky would end up demoting him down to the fourth line in favor of Patrick Giles. I had mentioned a few games ago that you kind of just come to the understanding that Dellandrea is a player who will maybe occasionally get like an okay offensive chance heading to the net, but more often than not is just going to be somewhat physical. Dellandrea did barely even accomplish that here tonight, only ended up with a singular hit in this game. And if you're really only going to bring some level of physicality and the occasional offensive chance, you want more from a third liner. And so putting him onto a fourth line probably is much more so where he belongs. To move on to that fourth line, Patrick Giles, I mentioned, he got the promotion up to the third to play with Kovalenko and Kostin. I don't necessarily disagree with that. Giles, I thought, again here tonight was pretty good. Not really much in terms of offense doing, but as I have mentioned many times in the past, when it comes to the fourth line, you're not really hoping for goals and points to be scored, as much as that would be nice. You're mostly just hoping that the play occurs in the offensive zone when they are on the ice, or definitely just not the defensive zone, and they accomplished this. Giles was a part of it, and so I liked his game. Then we have the newest San Jose Shark, who's also one of the oldest San Jose Sharks when you take a look at this roster, Noah Gregor. He was here a few years ago, comes back in that Fabian Zetterlund trade. I was actually somewhat surprised to see him in the lineup because of the fact that Grundstrom actually had one of his best games of the season the other night against Nashville, so I thought there really wouldn't be much of a kind of opportunity for Gregor to draw in, but I guess Warsofsky doesn't really care, and so he puts Gregor in, and I can't say that it was necessarily the worst decision, because Gregor actually skated quite hard, looked pretty good, and was an all-around effective player for San Jose. And then when it comes to Barclay Goodrow, I had mentioned that he started getting some of those late shifts in the game with that second line, defended the lead, I guess, decently well. Before that, when he's more of this fourth line position, we did see why Warsofsky has decided to never, and will likely continue to never, healthy scratch Barclay Goodrow this season after Macklin Celebrini takes a cross-check to the side of the head from Jason Dickinson. Barclay Goodrow, just a couple of shifts later, ends up answering the bell, so to speak, and fighting Dickinson. There really wasn't much to this, very much an arranged fight, but I guess it goes to show that he's sticking up for his teammate, which coaches absolutely love, and so Goodrow continues to lock down a lineup spot for the rest of this season because of that. And all around, with that being said, it was a pretty decent game for him. He's actually been on a bit of a hot streak, if you can call it, for himself, with not being the worst player on the ice for a couple of games now. When it comes to the Sharks' defense, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Mukhamadullin. And I'll start off with Mukhamadullin because he had an incredible first period. He was by far the Sharks' best defenseman in that opening frame. He was doing it all. Defensively, I thought he was standing up, really being aggressive in the defensive zone, poking pucks off of Bedard's stick right very early on in this game, making sure that Jason Dickinson doesn't get an easy entry to the zone, just being really, really smart in his own end, but also offensively jumping up, being aggressive, joining into the play. We see him get a chance in the slot in that first period. We see him crashing the net as well on a future shift. He was just doing everything you wanted him to do in all three zones in those first 20 minutes. Unfortunately for Mukhamadullin, as this game wore on, he kind of fell off a cliff. The second and third period left a lot to be desired, mostly when it came to puck management. I can tolerate an error or two here or there, especially for a young player like Mukhamadullin, but there were a lot of errors, a lot of giveaways being made. I was actually quite curious. I don't usually check this, but I made sure to look at NHL.com, and they had him pegged for 6 giveaways here tonight. That is an absurd amount. That is by far leading this team this particular game. Something absolutely to clean up. We want to see more of the first period Mukhamadullin, much less of the second and third period. But all in all, because of how strong those first 20 minutes actually were, I'd still say he had a pretty decent game. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, I also very much appreciated Ferraro's performance here tonight. I had mentioned that when these two players are on the ice, I'm mostly looking at what Mukhamadullin is doing. Ferraro kind of has to stand out in a big way if I were to point him out, and I think he actually did that here tonight. A couple of really impressive passes that he was able to create in this situation. A nice setup for a 2-on-1, I believe, for Will Smith and Colin Graff. He also ended up picking up the assist on this second Graff goal with a smart keep in at the blue line. And so generally, I was a fan of Ferraro's game here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing of Vlasic and Liljegren, I thought they were okay. They didn't really do much when it comes to actually playing in their own zone, but defensively, I don't think that they were all too bad. Liljegren had a pretty decent game. Vlasic slightly below that, but still relatively solid, so not much to say there. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, first up, Vincent Desharnais continues to impress me. I had mentioned that the true challenge will come once the Sharks actually go up against some better teams. Tonight was not one of those teams. Obviously, on Saturday, when they go up up against the best team in the NHL, the Washington Capitals. That will be a true test. But still, even against teams that are closer to the Sharks level, the fact that Desharnais has been very solid defensively, holds his own in front of the net, doesn't really allow any sort of nonsense to go on in the crease or right outside of the crease. I've been a big fan of the hole that Desharnais has filled with the replacement of Jan Rutta, who of course didn't even do a very good job of filling into that hole himself. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Jimmy Schuldt, it was a game in which it started off okay. Obviously he's not like a big name in this roster. He's not going to make a lot of waves every single night. But then you see the situation on this Mikheyev goal where Schuldt is the big reason for why this one ends up getting scored. Just an incorrect choice to step up in the defensive zone, leaves his man completely uncovered, which causes Desharnais to have to kind of hesitate a little bit, doesn't know where he needs to stand, can't cover Mikheyev in front of the net. He's left all alone and scores that goal. So I didn't like that call from Schuldt. So in the end, I would say wasn't really a good game for him. We'll see if he ends up maintaining his lineup spot going into a much more difficult opponent like Washington. I imagine he does. I had floated the idea of bringing up someone like Luca Cagnoni simply because the Sharks were going up against much easier competition in these two games like Nashville and Chicago. Going up against a Washington where there's a ton of skill, you don't really want your 5'9", first NHL game defenseman to be making a debut, so Schuldt probably holds on to it with the injuries to Thrun and Rutta continuing. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender Alexander Georgiev. He gets yet another start here in a row. It has been pretty crazy how much Warsawski is leaning on him. I thought tonight would be the perfect opportunity to have Romanov play a game because why not? But I guess Warsawski disagrees with me. Georgiev was pretty good actually. This first goal that he lets into Nazar, not an amazing one to have given up. It is through a screen of Mario Ferraro, and it is a good shot, but maybe one he could have had. The Mikheyev goal doesn't really have much of a chance on it due to the breakdown in front of him defensively, and with the fact that he only lets in 2 goals, how upset can you really be? But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday. They'll be going up against going from playing the other worst team in the league besides themselves to now playing the best team in the league, the Washington Capitals. Some people thought that perhaps in this one, Alexander Ovechkin would be going for that potentially record-tying goal or record-breaking goal to pass Wayne Gretzky for most goals all time in the NHL history. Not going to be the case. I believe currently Ovechkin is trailing by 8. So unless he puts up the famed Ovech trick, it's not going to happen. But perhaps he'll end up scoring 1 or 2 and the Sharks will be a part of history in the sense. The Sharks actually did beat Washington in their first matchup this season. So perhaps the Capitals will also be looking for some revenge and we'll see what happens. Class dismissed.